Hence, I'll start it. Okay. So in today's topic, we are going to discuss about long distance transport of water. So I told you this, there is another term that you can use for this, ascent of sap. So the long distance transport of water, as you can see in the background picture, so the water is absorbed by the plants. The water is absorbed by the plants through the root hairs. The water enters through the root hair into the epidermal cell. From the epidermal cell, the water enters into the cortical cells. From the cortical cells, they enter into the endodermis, and from the endodermis, at the endodermis they have passage cells. So waters enter through the passage cell. Passage cell does not have this Casparian thickening, so they enter through the passage cell, which is exactly opposite to the xylem element. So the water flows into this xylem. So from the root the water enters through the xylem, and then they travel against the uh, gravitational force and supply water to each and every part of the plant. So up to the tip of the stem, they are going to provide this, supply this water. Okay, so initial movement of water, which is horizontal, we call it as radial movement of water, and against the gravitational force, we have it as the long distance transport of water or ascent of sap, you can call it as. And this long distance transport of water is unidirectional. We have already discussed in the introduction of this chapter. Okay, so let us understand about this long distance transport of water. There are two things that you should understand here. One is the pathway of transport of water. So through which cells are this water being transported? And second one is mechanism of transport of water. What makes the water to climb from the root against the gravitational force to the tip of the cells? So those theories we are going to discuss about, and which is the most accepted theory. We are not going to describe about the various theories, but we are going to talk about the theory which is most accepted, that is the capillarity theory. Okay, so that we are going to discuss about, not the capillarity, rather the transpirational pull theory or cohesion tension theory. That is the most accepted theory for the long distance transport of water, so which explains even for a 110-meter tall tree. See, some of these root pressure, capillarity theories. So the ascent of sap will be, the transport of water will be sufficient for short plants. But for some of the plants which are nearly 110-meter tall in height, for them, the transport of water should be by a greater force than capillarity or root pressure. So that is the transpirational pull theory or cohesion tension theory. So which we'll be discussing in this particular topic. So let us proceed with this topic. So diffusion is a slow process which you are already aware about. It's a gradual and slow process. It accounts only for short distance movement. So the movement of water because of diffusion is only for short movement. So they have also measured the movement of molecules across a typical plant cell. So about 50 micron meter, a typical plant cell, which is about 50 micron meter in uh, the width, it takes about 2.5 seconds. Long distance transport systems are necessary to move substances faster across the long distances. It cannot be a very slow process. The transport of water should be faster for long distances, especially huge gigantic trees. So with this force of moving about 50 micron meter movement, if it takes 2.5 seconds, just visualize the movement of water for an 110-meter tall tree. So it would be too late for the plants to survive. So how is it taking place? So the long distance transport systems cannot happen through diffusion because it's a slow process. So there should be a faster movement of water across this long distances. So movement of substances in bulk, en mass, that is from one point to another point due to pressure difference between the 2 points is called as mass flow. So the movement of substance, that is bulk n mass, from one point to another point due to pressure differences between the 2 points. There is a pressure difference. It will be a lower pressure here, higher pressure will be at the tip. So due to the pressure differences between the 2 points, we call it as mass flow. So the water, minerals, and food are generally moved by a mass flow system, which is due to the difference in pressures. Okay. In mass flow, substances which are in solution or in suspension are carried away at the same pace as in a flowing river. So the mass flow is possible because of differences in pressure. So you can see that anything that you throw it in a river, like if the river has certain uh, debris of plant or a debris of or fruits of a plant. So they are carried at the same speed as in a flowing river. So they are carried by a flowing river along with the flowing water. Similarly, in mass flow, the substances which are there in solution or suspension, so they are equally carried in the same pace as similar to that of a substance which has been uh, which is floating in a river. So when they move in the same pace or same magnitude, even in case of mass flow, the substances which are dissolved in solution or in suspension, they also move with the same pace. But in diffusion, different substances move independently depending on their concentration gradients. So now you can understand how diffusion is not the correct explanation for long distance transport of water. Because in diffusion, the movement of substances depend, they are move independently depending on their concentration gradient. That is from higher concentration to lower concentration. But that is not there in case of mass flow. Okay, so bulk flow is achieved either through a positive hydrostatic pressure gradient, that is a garden hose, or negative pressure hydrostatic pressure gradient, example suction through a straw. So flow is achieved. This mass flow is achieved through a positive hydrostatic pressure gradient, that is a garden hose. See, positive pressure gradient is when you turn on the tap and you have a hose pipe connected to it. So the water flows through a positive pressure, it flows out because there is more pressure from the water tap. The water flows through this pipe. Now there is a flow of water due to negative hydrostatic pressure gradient. Okay, example suction through a straw. So you have put a straw in a soft drink. So now will the soft drink climb along the straw? See, the straw has two openings, isn't it? When you put it into the soft drink bottle, so you notice that the solution or this, what do we have here? Soft drinks. It might be Coke or anything. It moves to certain direction up in the straw. That is because of atmospheric pressure. But if you have just a straw there and keep it in your mouth, does the soft drink enter into your mouth? It doesn't happen. What are you going to do there for the soft to drink the soft drink? What you are doing is you are sucking the straw pipe. So suction pressure is a negative hydrostatic pressure which draws the soft drinks from the uh, bottle, and that is how it reaches your mouth. So this negative hydrostatic pressure gradient, example suction through a straw of soft drinks. So that is an also one of the reason for mass flow. See, while there might be a positive hydrostatic pressure gradient, wherein when you open the tap connected with the hose pipe, so the water, because of the high pressure, they flow through this hose pipe. Okay. Now the same hose pipe, earlier days we used to have a boiler where it was not a geyser which was fitted in the walls. It used to be a boiler. I don't know how many of you still have that. Okay, it used to be a tank where it had a heat heating coil. So boiler we used to call it as, and the water used to be present there. So most of the times the hot water, you had to take it from the boiler and pour it into the buckets. So what we used to do then was put a small hose pipe into it, suck at one end. So once you suck and the water starts flowing to your mouth, that is the point when you take the pipe out of your mouth and you let the pipe into the uh, bucket. That is how the hot water used to get filled in the bucket. So that was by creating a suction pressure. It is a negative pressure that we are creating. Negative hydrostatic pressure gradient is created. And I've given you even the example of the soft drinks. When you're sucking a soft drink, so the suction pressure is a negative hydrostatic pressure gradient. So that results in the solution moving against the gravitational force. Okay. And that suction pressure is greater than the atmospheric pressure. That also you should remember. So the bulk movement of substances in long distance through the conducting tissue, that is xylem and phloem, we call it as translocation. So the bulk movement of substances in long distance through the conducting tissues, which can be either xylem or phloem, we call it as translocation. Okay. So let us understand the absorption of water by plants. See, absorption of water and minerals, they occur by diffusion through millions of root hairs present at the root tips. So the root hairs are there, which are unicellular extension of this epidermal cell. We have already described about that. So millions of root hairs present in the root, they help in the absorption of water and minerals, and that is by diffusion it enters. Okay, root hair increases the surface area available for absorption. Just visualize there was no root hair and there was just a flat cell. So the surface area available for absorption would be lesser. The root hair, whenever they are present, you can see that the surface area will be more. Root hair increases the surface area for absorption, just like in microvilli of animal cells, which helps in absorption, increasing the surface area. The root hair increases the surface area for absorption of water and minerals. The absorbed water is moved deeper into root layers by two pathways. See, the water available in the soil for absorption, we call it as crescent. That water is taken up. So the plants take up the water that is available for absorption called as crescent, and that water is taken up along with minerals. Water and minerals ions are absorbed through this root hair. So let us understand the entry of water. How does it move into the root? So the radial transport of water. So how does it reach the xylem of the root? So there is an horizontal transport from the epiblemma to the xylem. So the movement of water is horizontal. So how does this radial transport of water take place? So there are two pathways, apoplast pathway and symplast pathway. There are two pathways for entry of water into the uh, xylem of the root, that is by apoplast pathway and symplast pathway. So let us understand the first part of it, apoplast pathway. See, in case of apoplast pathway, it is a system of adjacent cells. Adjacent means akapaka cells, the neighboring cells. It is a system of adjacent cell walls that is continuous except at the Casparian strips of the endodermis in the roots. So in apoplast pathway, the water movement occurs extensively through the intercellular spaces and walls of the cells. It does not cross the cell membrane. It does not cross the cell membrane. So you can notice this apoplastic pathway. So they are moving across the cell walls, adjacent cell walls. So can you notice this blue colored one, dark blue colored one? They are moving across the non-living components of the cell, apoplast. So they are moving along the intercellular spaces and the walls of the cells. It does not cross the cell membrane anywhere. It is moving along the intercellular spaces and walls of the cells, and it reaches the passage cell. So it does not cross any cell membrane, and it is a not passing through any living component. So we call this pathway through the non-living component of the cell as apoplast pathway. Okay, so water movement through apoplast is dependent on gradient and occurs through mass flow. The apoplast does not provide any barrier to water movement. As water evaporates into the intercellular spaces or the atmosphere, tension develops in the continuous stream of water in the apoplast. Hence, mass flow of water occurs due to the adhesive and cohesive properties of water in case of apoplast pathway. So the mass flow of water occurs due to the adhesive and cohesive properties of water. So that is what we call it as the apoplast pathway. It is through the non-living components of the cell. So, and it is through the cell walls and intercellular spaces that the water enters. So as water evaporates in the intercellular spaces or the atmosphere, the tension develops for the continuous stream of water in the apoplast. Hence, the mass flow of water in apoplast pathway occurs due to the adhesive and cohesive properties of water. So what are this adhesive and cohesive property of water? So cohesive property is the between like molecules, between the same molecules, the force of attraction, we call it as cohesive force. Adhesive force is the force of attraction between dissimilar molecules. Okay, as kids you might have played, even now you might have played, you might have placed two water droplets. Okay, if they are very close together, immediately the water droplet joins, isn't it? Have you noticed that? If it is a little farther away, where the force of attraction between these two like molecules doesn't exist, then they don't fuse. A little closer where their force of attraction can be exists. So then you find that these two water molecules, they are going to join. So you might have played with this water droplets. So the two water droplets join in if they are a little closer to each other. So the force of attraction between similar molecules, water to water molecules, cohesive force. The force of attraction between water placed on a Petri plate. So force of attraction between water and the glass molecule, the Petri plate. That force of attraction between dissimilar molecules, we call it as adhesive force. So the adhesive and cohesive force is the reason for the water to move along in a continuous column, or else there would be air bubbles or air gap formed. So why does the water moves as a continuous column is because of the adhesive and cohesive properties. Cohesive property is force of attraction between water and water. Adhesive property is force of attraction between the water and the walls, or water and the Petri plate if you are placed the water droplets on a Petri plate. Okay. Now that is about the so the mass flow of water in apoplast pathway. It occurs due to the adhesive and cohesive properties of water. So it is going to the apoplast pathway is through the non-living components of the cell. Okay. In Simplast pathway, what do you notice here is the system of interconnected protoplasts. So there are plasmodesmatal connections between the protoplasts of different cells. So the interconnected protoplasts, you can notice that. So what you notice in Simplast pathway is it is a system of interconnected protoplasts. In this pathway, the water travels to the through the cytoplasm, and intercellular movement is through plasmodesmata, that is the junction between neighboring cells through which cytoplasmic strands extend, and they finally reach the xylem. So it is through the living components of the cell. In Simplast pathway, the flow of water, mass flow of water, is through the interconnected protoplast, and it is moving through the living component of cells. So we call it as the Simplast pathway. So in Simplast pathway, it is a system of interconnected protoplasts. So the water from the root hair enters into the epidermal cells. So they are an unicellular extension of epidermis itself is root hair. So water enters the epidermis and it moves into the cortical cells through this plasmodesmatal connection. From the cortical cells, the water moves into the endodermis, the passage cell especially, which does not have Casparian thickenings. So they enter this passage cells through the plasmodesmatal connection. From the endodermis, the water, the mass flow takes place through the protoplasm of the plasmodesmatal connection of the pericycle. From the pericycle, the water enters into the xylem. So it is a system of interconnected protoplasm. So in simplest pathway, the mass flow of water is through the system of interconnected protoplasm. It is through the living components of the cell. In this pathway, the water flows through the cytoplasm. Intercellular movement is through the plasmodesmata. That is, what is plasmodesmata? The cytoplasmic connection between the adjacent cells. We call it as plasmodesmata. So that is the junction between neighboring cells through which cytoplasmic strands extend. So water has to enter the cells through the cell membrane here, that is plasma membrane. Hence the movement is slower. Movement is down a potential gradient. See, symplastic movement can be aided by the cytoplasmic streaming. You can see that the cytoplasm will be moving in a cyclic process. Okay, so especially in hydrilla leaf, a movement of chloroplast due to cytoplasmic streaming is easily visible. You have to take a hydrilla leaf and observe it under the microscope. So you can see the chloroplast rotating within the cytoplasm. We call it a cytoplasmic streaming. So that you can notice in this submerged aquatic plant hydrilla leaf. So symplastic movement, that is movement of mass movement of water through the cytoplasm, is also assisted by cytoplasmic streaming. So the entry of water through the cell membrane is going to be slow. Water has to enter the cells through the cell membrane. Hence, the simplast pathway is slower than the apoplast pathway. And movement is down a potential gradient. It has to move through a potential gradient. That is also one of the shortcoming of it. So most of the water flowed in the roots occur via the apoplast since the cortical cells are loosely packed. So water can move without resistance in apoplast pathway. However, endodermis is impervious to water. That is, it does not allow water to enter through because of the Casparian strip. Casparian strip is deposition of suberinization process. So a band of suberized matrix. Suberin is hydrophobic. So water molecules are directed to non-suberized wall regions, that is the passage cells. Okay, so the endodermis is not going to allow water to flow through all the cells. They only such endodermal cells which do not have suberized wall, that is the passage cells, only through them the water enters. The water then moves through the symplast and again crosses a membrane to reach the xylem. Okay, so that is what you have to remember about the water after this entry into the non-superized wall regions. It has to move through the symplast and again cross a membrane to reach the xylem. So from the endodermis to the pericycle and from pericycle to the xylem. So the water movement through the root layers is ultimately symplastic in the endodermis. Finally, whatever the entry, whether it is apoplast or symplast, finally it has to be through only one method, that is symplastic in the endodermis. So the water entry in the endodermis is symplastic. Through the cell membrane, it has to enter. Okay, this is the only way water and solutes can enter the vascular cylinder, that is the xylem. In young roots, water enters directly into the xylem vessels and tracheids. So these are in only in young roots you can notice that water directly flows into the xylem vessels and tracheids, and these are considered to be the non-living conduits and so are part of the apoplast. Okay, so apoplast pathway is predominant in case of young roots. where water entered directly into the xylem vessel and tracheids. But in older routes, whether it is apoplast or symplast pathway, finally when they are going to enter the endodermal cell, it is through symplastic pathway. So that differences you should know. Whereas in young roots, predominantly it is apoplast pathway, that is the mass flow of water is through the non-living components of cell, non-living conduits they are. Okay. See, some of the plants, like they have taken a example here, they have white fibers. Apart from the root, they have this whitish nature on the roots. So some of the plants have additional structures for water and mineral absorption. We call it as mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza are fungal outgrowths. So there is a symbiotic association of fungi with a root system. So we call it as mycorrhiza. So these mycorrhiza help the plant in additional structure which is for absorption of water and mineral absorption. So there is a symbiotic association, give and take. Symbiosis is both the mycorrhiza and the plants get benefited from each other. Okay, so a symbiotic association of a fungus with a root system. So the fungal filaments, that is mycorrhiza, they are going to form a network around the young root and they penetrate into the root cells. So the mycorrhiza hyphae, that is the filamentous structures of mycorrhiza, they absorb mineral ions and water from soil. So roots provide sugar and nitrogen compounds to mycorrhizae. So the mineral ions and water from the soil is absorbed by the mycorrhiza, and roots are going to provide the mycorrhiza with, in turn, they provide the mycorrhiza with sugar and nitrogen compounds. So some of the plants, they have an obligate association with the mycorrhiza. What is an obligate? Obligate is mandatory or compulsory association with the mycorrhiza. Example is pinus seeds. Pinus is nothing but a gymnosperm plant. These pinus seeds cannot germinate and establish without the activity of mycorrhiza. So some plants have an compulsory association with the mycorrhiza, like in case of this gymnosperm plant, Pinus. The Pinus seeds, they cannot germinate unless there is a mycorrhizal association. So unless they establish with the mycorrhizae, the Pinus seeds cannot germinate. So this sort of symbiotic association of mycorrhizae, wherein the mycorrhizae is a fungi, it is going to be found associated with the roots, a large network of it. The hyphae is going to absorb the mineral ions and water from the soil, and in turn, the roots provide this mycorrhizae with nitrogen compounds and sugars is provided to the mycorrhizae. Some of the plants have mandatory or compulsory association with the mycorrhizae. Like example, pinus seeds cannot germinate without mycorrhizae. So they should establish contact with mycorrhizae and they should have mycorrhizae for the pinus seeds to germinate. So that is what you have to remember about apoplast and sympast pathway. So in the next class, we'll discuss about this water movement upper plant. So uptake of water, how is it going to happen? So that water movement upper plant will be discussing in the next class. So interesting theories are there. Okay, so in today's class, we have discussed up to apoplast and symplast pathway. So in the next class, what we will be discussing is, we'll be discussing about the theories concerned with uptake of water. Okay, so let me just stop.